C# 12 is with us, and so I'm going to be spending the next few videos looking at some features that have come on with that. And the one we're going to look at this time is the idea of primary constructors. Now, before we look at any C#, I just thought we'd take a little bit of a look at some TypeScript, because it's a very useful feature in TypeScript, and although it's not done exactly the same way in C#, I thought it was worth the comparison. And so what I've got here, this is just the TypeScript playground, so you can see on the left some TypeScript and on the right the JavaScript it generates. But I've got a very simple class for a book that's got fields, ID, title and year, and then a constructor. That's just the actual word constructor in TypeScript. And then we've got the ID, title, year being passed in there. The way that TypeScript does types is colon and then the type comes after the variable name rather than before it as in C#. But once we've got those parameters passed into the constructor, we then set up those individual fields. And that's something that looks very similar structurally to what we have in C#, and it has the same problem that we are basically repeating ourselves. We're saying essentially the same thing 3 times, because for the ID we have to declare it as a field, we have to declare it as a parameter, and then we have to assign the parameter into the field. And we've got to do that for every one of the ones we're setting up through the constructor. And so what we have in TypeScript is a really neat feature where I can get rid of all of that, and I can get rid of all of that, and I can simply put the word private on any of the constructor parameters that I want to. And having done that, that now is exactly equivalent to what I had before. So putting the keyword private in there means those things are declared as private fields and also in the constructor, and you can see that part of it in the JavaScript. Don't get the declarations in JavaScript, but it also sets them up. So because we're repeating ourselves trying to do those 3 separate things, we can do it all in one go simply by putting the keyword private on the constructor parameters. And as you might expect, you could also do public and you get exactly the same thing, except the fields will be public rather than private. So it's one of my favorite little features of TypeScript, and I often wish I could do a similar sort of thing in C#. Well, with C# primary constructors, you can. So let's now take a look at some C#, and what we've got here is a very simple web API application. We've got a model called book, just the same as we saw there in TypeScript. We've got a book context, a DB context. We're connecting that to an SQLite database. We're then injecting that into a repository. We're injecting the repository into a controller, and the controller has got a couple of endpoints, a get and a put, just for examples. And also, as well as injecting the repository in here, we're also injecting a logger, just so we can see a couple of things being injected. So if I run that up, we'll see the sort of thing we're familiar with. So there we've got the get and the put, and if we just try that out, we can see we get all of those books that I've preloaded into the database. So let's take a look at actually using these primary constructors. And I'm going to start by looking at actually the model class, the book that we've got there. Now I should point out, as we'll see, this probably isn't a particularly good candidate for using primary constructors for reasons we'll see, but it does at least allow us to look at the syntax. So worth saying first, actually there is a situation in C# where we already have primary constructors, which is the idea of records, which has been around for quite a while. So if I just turn this from a class into a record class, then the syntax is I put the constructor parameters on the class itself. So on there, I can say int ID, string title, and int year. And then get rid of the properties, because on a record, by putting those parameters into the primary constructor, I'm actually creating the properties of those names and types. That's why, even though these are parameters and therefore they'd normally be camel-cased with initial lowercase, because they're actually producing properties and want the properties to be uppercase, then that's why we put it in like that. And having done that, if I now build this, that's going to introduce us a few errors. And so the first lot of errors is actually in the code here, where I'm creating those books, because now I have to use that constructor. And so what I can do here is change all of that into an open quotes, get rid of the year equals, put on the close round brackets, and also introduce just another initial parameter, because we've got to have the ID in there, even though it's going to be generated by the database. So I'll just make that 0. So that's now using the constructor. We still have one other error, and this is really why a record isn't appropriate there, because if we go to the controller, we can see here on the put, the thing about a record is it is immutable. So although we can read this data, we can create this data, we can't actually change it, which is what you want to do in a put. So we're getting an error at that point. Let's just comment that out for the moment so that we can see some other things about this. That should now finally build okay. And the reason I want it to build is so we can actually have a look inside that class that was created. So what I've got up here is quite an old tool in .NET, but it still does the job, which is the ILDASM, the Intermediate Language Disassembler, which means if we go down and get hold of the DLL for this application in there, we can just drag that over and start looking at what's going on. And if we look in that book class that we've got there we can see it's obviously got properties. So there we've got our ID, title and year are the properties with the setters and the getters. The setters are in this slightly strange way. Basically that's saying that they are init only, so that's why we weren't allowed to write even though we're allowed to initialize. But you can see that that record has generated properties, and the properties correspond to the parameters that we passed in. So that is the concept for a primary constructor, but with a record, not with a regular class. What we can now do as a C#12 is have that same syntax but have it on a plain old class, or indeed a struct, which we won't look at here, but it applies to structs as well. And so now we're doing a similar sort of thing, but it's no longer a record, it's a class. And that once again generates a class with a constructor that takes those three parameters. So if we look in the program, we can see that's still all working fine. It's taking those three parameters. We could have done the other sorts of things you can do with constructor parameters, like default them or something like that. But what's being generated is now slightly different. Because if I build that, and then again we bring up the Intermediate Language Disassembler to take a look at it, and then once again just drag in the DLL. Now if we take a look at the book, we can see that it's rather simpler. And in fact, it's got nothing at all but that constructor. And the reason it's got nothing at all is because we haven't made any use of it, and so it's done a bit of an optimization. So let's at the very least go back to that book and put in, let's just do a toString. And what we'll do is just display that data. So there's our ID, there's our title, and there's our year. And so that means actually making use of them. And so now if we build it, and again, bring up the disassembler and show the content. Now it looks a bit more complicated because it's given us these generated private fields. And that's a key thing to notice. When we had the record, the things in the primary constructor were properties, but here we're just getting fields. And it's given them slightly made up names, ID in angle brackets P, title in angle brackets P, year in angle brackets P, but that's what it's generated from the constructor and initialized in the constructor. And notice we're not actually referring to it quite like that in the code, we're referring to it just as the name we had there. But one thing that's worth noticing, you can't refer to these things with this. So with normal members, inside the class, you can refer to them as this.memberName or just as member name. And you only really need to use the this if there's any ambiguity. But here, it's just not there. We can only refer to them as the name without the this because it's not really the name at all. The compiler is converting that into the actual name, the angle brackets name that we can see in there. But another thing to notice there is that because these are now fields, in terms of a naming convention, it would be more appropriate to have them in camel case with a lowercase on there, and then that just is the normal naming convention for private fields, which is what we've got. So we could do that as well, and that would be fine. So that's the sort of thing that we can do in there. But even so, it's still a problem because we now don't have the properties. If I went back to the book controller and uncommented that, it now doesn't even know what title and year are because they are private fields, they're not public properties. So if we then wanted to get this working, we'd have to do something like this. We'd have to put in here a property of type int that we call ID, but then we'd have to set that up so that the get returns the field ID and the set can have the ID set to the value. And then we'd have to go through the other two as well and set all of those up as properties, just to get us back to what we had with the original class. And so, although we could get there, in this case it seems to me that using a primary constructor, indeed using any constructor at all on one of these entity classes, is just not worth it. So let's take that all the way back so that we've got just auto-implemented properties that will be working fine for us. So that's where we have that there. And that means we should now be able to go back to the program, and we need to change that back to what we had before using the property initializer, and back in the books controller, that should now all be working. So we're back where we started, because that really wasn't a suitable thing to have a primary constructor on. And indeed, if we look at the error list in here, we can see that under those messages, it's suggesting that we use a primary constructor, but it's only suggesting it on three classes: the book context, the book repository, and the books controller, not on the book itself. So Visual Studio didn't think that was a very good idea, but it does think it is in these other cases. And the reason it's so useful is that it's really good when you're dealing with dependency injection. So if we just take a look at some of these, and let's look first at the repository. So in here, we've got, again, like I showed you in the TypeScript, this triple repetition. So there we've got the declaration of the field, there we've got the constructor parameter, and there we've got the assignment of one into the other. And if we just take a look at this, it will help us out, saves me a bit of typing. You can see I can go for use primary constructor actually in a couple of ways. If I go for this second one, do the and remove fields, this will give us most like what I was just showing you. So there's the syntax we have. So we've got the class name, then the primary constructor, just taking the one parameter book context, and then we've got to have the interface, so colon iBook repository comes after that. And that's now given us a private field that we can refer to as context. Remember, we said it's strictly speaking it's going to be angle brackets context P, but we refer to it as context, and so we can get hold of it there, and that's all pretty neat. So that is certainly a saving compared to what we had here. There is actually one very slight difference in terms of the code there, though, which is here we declared the context as read-only, which means if we were, say, in here just to put a fully bodied function in there, it would be possible, let's say I change that context to a nullable context, and that one there, I'm actually not allowed to set the context inside the code. I don't really know I'd want to do that, but that's what the read-only is there for, to prevent us, so we don't get an error if I've got it there. We do get an error when we have the read-only on there. But if I switch this back to having the primary constructor, the way that's declared is not with read-only. So we can now set that, even though we don't want to. Not a huge problem, but it is a slight difference between the two. And that's why we have this other option in here, which is we can use primary constructor and not remove the field. So if I use that one, you'll see that we still declare the field, and therefore it can have the keyword read-only on it, and therefore we're getting the error. So now we can see there's the parameter of the primary constructor, and that is being used to initialize the underscore context. So you can use a primary constructor parameter in the initialization of any of your fields, and that means we can declare it as read-only, which means we get the error in there. So it's a bit more long-winded, but it allows us to introduce read-only or any other possible keywords we might want on there. That said, the use of read-only, it's just a little safety check to stop us doing something really stupid that I think it's quite unlikely that we do. It's conceivable you might get a performance benefit from using read-only, but in practice, from what I've seen reading around, that really isn't an issue. It's just there to save us from ourselves. So, to be honest, I would probably stick with going for the simpler form, where we have the primary constructor without any fields, and therefore we have to worry for ourselves that don't do something stupid like assign into it, which I wouldn't really be worried about too much anyway. So there you can see that, I would say, is the form we want this in. We do get one other slight issue there. This is now both a parameter and the name of a field. And depending on what naming conventions you adopt, that might give you a slight conflict in that parameters are always going to be camel-cased, so like we have there for context, Whereas fields, personally, I like to precede them with an underscore, but you can't do that because they've got to be the same. And I'd say you certainly don't want to be putting an underscore in there because that is changing your public interface. The name of that parameter actually matters in terms of when you're using name parameters or something like that. So if you're going to compromise, the compromise has to be that your fields don't have the underscore. Again, if you have a separate field declaration, then it doesn't have to be that case. So that's probably the form I'd go for here. Let's look at the next one, which we're going to take a look at the controller. So if we go to the books controller, again, that's suggesting we use a primary constructor if we go over here. So if we take a look at that, this one slightly different because it's got two parameters and therefore the benefits are actually rather greater. So you'll find this a lot when you're doing this dependency injection, multiple parameters. It just gets more and more long-winded. So let's sort that out. And again, I'll do this removing the fields. So we have that. Interestingly, and this is just the Visual Studio code generator, it didn't quite do it fully. It removed the field for the repository, but not for the logger. So actually we'll have to do that by hand and then just rename the logger like that. I was just using the logger so we'd have multiple parameters so we could see that sort of thing. But now we can see there we have the parameters for the constructor. You might start thinking about laying this out a bit differently because that's starting to get quite long-winded, so you probably want to do something maybe a bit like that just so you can see it. But basically we've got those passed in, and so we've got logger, we've got the book repository, and that should all be working in the same way. Again, we've got that slight issue that they are not read-only anymore, but it's unlikely you're going to be changing them because that's just not something you want to do. So there we've got that there, and then finally we can have a look at the context. This one's slightly different because in this case, the parameters coming into the constructor need to be passed down to the base class. And so what we can see here, if we do the conversion, is it's not giving us the option to do it without fields because there aren't any fields involved anyway. So it simply does that. So you can see that you have your inheritance, :db context, and then you pass to the base class constructor using that syntax there. And so that now should have it all working. So we've lost those messages about the primary constructor. And if we run that up, we'll see that it's working in exactly the same way, but it's just been simplified a little, particularly on that dependency injection. We don't have to repeat ourselves with the declaration of the field, the declaration of the parameter, and then assigning the parameter into the field. One other thing to mention in there, we still can have, even with primary constructors, we can have the concept of constructor overloading. So if we, for example, go back to our book, even though this wasn't a suitable one, and let's get that back to having the primary constructor. So that's what we had there. And then if you wanted other constructors, you can do that. So let's suppose we wanted a default constructor. We can just generate the code. We have that there. And that's giving us an error because the rule is if you have overloaded constructors, they must call the primary constructor, even though they may pass in different parameters. So if we wanted a default constructor, we have to say :this, so this is how you call one constructor for another, and then pass in 0 and blank and 0 or whatever we wanted to do. So perfectly okay to have whatever other overloaded constructors you want, but they all must use :this and then call the primary constructor. That has to be called somehow or other. But as I say, we really didn't want that. We were much happier on the book to have it the other way around. So that was it, the C#12 concept of a primary constructor. We saw that in a class like book, which was an entity or a model, it's probably not appropriate, but when it came to things with dependency injection, that's where I see it's really going to be beneficial to save us that triplication of writing the field, writing the parameter, and assigning one into the other. I'm sure as I get more familiar with it, I may find other uses for it, but that's the one that seems most obvious to me because what it allows to do is write clearer, more concise code. So there's still other features to look at in C#12, which we're doing over the next few videos. But if you did like that video, do click like, do subscribe, and I'll see you next time.